couple of days back on Former Bird site, I did a post where I was trying to explain very briefly, and I was on the road, so I couldn't really go into it in a lot of detail because I'm busy, how tariffs are being argued back and forth. And a lot of folks don't really understand the real problem or the real meaning behind tariffs that isn't going to be explained. There's no college in this, there's no university probably on this planet that will discuss this. Probably because many of the people who are teaching it don't know it because they're not out in the game anymore. Most of them are third generation professors. So here's how this works. The US used to have manufacturing capacity and it got chased out of the country. Now everybody says, you know, the typical Rush Limbaugh Republican thing is like, oh, it's taxes and regulations. That's not the big one. That's important, yeah, but that's not the big one. The big one is the labor. Labor is cheaper, relatively speaking, in other countries. Keep in mind that in, like, say, you know, let's say 1900 in the US, you know, $2 to $3 a day was considered a pretty decent wage, right? There's a time dilation that sort of exists with other countries. So there's this this thing where it goes around where it's like, oh my gosh, these people only live on $2 a day. Yeah, but keep in mind there's a relativity involved there. And that relative to where they are, that can be a lot of money. Now, it can be nothing here, for example, but it can be a lot of money in some other country. And companies understand this. And that's why so many companies left, is because they can get cheaper and cheaper and cheaper labor in other countries and then sell it back to Americans who are used to a hyperinflated economy. And make no mistake, the dollar is hyperinflated. It's garbage. It's worthless. It's the most worthless currency that's ever existed on the planet. But that, in essence, is the foundation. So when these countries argue about tariffs, they can't come out and argue openly about the worthlessness of their currencies because they're all printing money. All these countries are printing money to pay for their pigs and for their military, because without their pigs and their military, their governments go away. All right, this is just self-preservation from the government perspective. Governments want to preserve themselves. You guys call it the so-called deep state. It's just the state. It's just government. It's just how it all works. Okay? So all of that said, tariffs are what they discuss because they can't just say, hey, you're devaluing your currency and you're devaluing your currency and, you know, you've printed a bunch of money to worthlessness. And like, they can't say that kind of stuff because then they'll all accuse everybody of doing that, and then it destroys all the currencies of the world. Now, I'm okay with that personally, as are many people who are outside that system who watch that and say, this should have collapsed decades ago. But that's the real gist of it. So when you're seeing all this stuff about tariffs, and the idea is that, well, okay, we're going to put this much tariff. In other words, what they're suggesting is that we think you guys are printing, let's say you put a 50% tariff on another country. Loosely translated, that would be like, we suspect you have printed 50% more currency in your country. And so therefore you've devalued that. So it's going to automatically create a trade imbalance. So what's the solution to this? Well, you would have a hard currency. See, back in the day, the U.S. used to have tariffs early on. That's true story, actually. You know, the Orange Man's right about that. Tariffs were really popular back in the day. They were particularly popular with Americans because they didn't have to have income taxes and sales taxes and da-da-da-da. They didn't have to have any of that stuff because the tariffs covered it. But the tariff was a tiny percentage. It was because other countries had to first purchase gold, or they had to go mine gold, or they had to go and get gold or steal it or whatever. They had to have gold, physical gold, in order to transact with the US, which at the time was the massive engine of production. And the reason it was a massive engine of production is because of just, that's the American way. Remember, all the productive people flooded into the US as quickly as they could. Once they found out that they could keep what they made, right, and they had private property and all kind of stuff, everybody flooded to the US from all over the world. And mostly Western Europe. They flooded here and they started building industry. And the reason being is because they could keep what they made. And this was early on, of course. I mean, now this all changed by about 1865, and therefore, you know, because then it went into, the currency started getting counterfeited to worthlessness, where Secret Service came from. Then there's the rest of the history that I've covered probably 24 times here. But early on, you had to first buy gold. You had to have gold in which to deal. Okay, so that means you could have a percentage that was, you know, a percentage of tariff of maybe like 0.5%, not 5%, but like 0.5%, and the government would still have plenty of money to deal with, right? Also, the idea was to keep government very, very limited, and of course, if you had a very thin law book, you don't need a lot of pigs and military, right? So that, in a nutshell, is what all of this is about. It's all these currencies are devaluing rapidly all over the world, and they're devaluing because well, you also have to figure birth rates are declining in a bunch of different countries too. I mean, let me pivot slightly, but that is affecting it because remember, people want to progress, and if they can't progress, then they feel like they are regressing. In other words, a recession. That's what it feels like. So that's why you have like roughly half of the US right now, they're like mostly men that are doing all the work. They're like, dude, we're in a recession. What the hell? My money doesn't buy anything. But the people who don't work and boomers and so on, they think that everything's going great. Well, yeah, I mean, for them, relative to the amount of work they're not doing, it's doing wonderful for them. Does that make sense? So, because the money's being conjured from nothing to prop them up, so that way they can continue to wag their finger at you and tell you that you're eating too much avocado toast and what have you. Or you're just not working hard enough, or you don't own a yacht, and so therefore you don't deserve this, this bomb-ass pussy and stuff like that. And like this is the kind of nonsense that we're seeing. Like this, and by the way, everything I'm telling you, this is just straight up how it is. I'm not as entertaining as some of the other influencers that are out there, and I don't consider myself an influencer. I'm just telling you what's going on. And because nobody else will, apparently. So to understand tariffs, that's all you need to understand. It's the devaluation of all these different currencies all over the world because their populations in many cases are in decline, or they're just run by stupid people. There's a lot of that going on too. Keep in mind, like these world leaders, these are not exactly the brightest bulbs in the chain, man. These are, you know what I mean? Like, right? They're just not. I know they come across like, dude, that's the media. That's hype. It's sort of like actors in movies. Most of the actors don't even look as good as they do in the movies. You meet them in person, and they don't look as good because it's makeup and stuff. Like, you know what I'm saying? So, same thing with these guys. Most of these guys are morons that the media covers up. And how do we spin it and everything? That's this team of people trying to make up stuff because they can't think for themselves. This kind of work right here, for example, I'm not to blow my own horn, but I mean, like, dude, this kind of work right here. Imagine a politician doing this, right? No edits, no nothing, just being able to straight talk to you because they actually know what the hell they're doing. Yeah, I mean, like, you don't see that.